Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss the experiences of the Kabul Garrison Command Advisor Team and contribute to the development of this doctrinal work. I say this sincerely because while I was deployed, I penned a short written piece for the Cove editors that asked the question about why the ADF hadn't produced doctrine on building partners' capacity, or train, advise, assist, as it's referred to in Afghanistan, despite the fact that it has been one of our main operational efforts that's been so well explained by speakers earlier today. So I think it's great, but perhaps one of the reasons we have been slow to codify it is because of the breadth of different forms that building partner capacity operation can take. And I think today, again, has sort of showcased the different types and different natures of BPC that the ADF have been involved in for the past 60 odd years. But I think it is possible to produce a doctrinal handrail that covers general considerations or universal considerations, and that we can guide our approach. And it's really good to contribute to that work. I'm also glad that I submitted my piece over Christmas and it's been held, because it would have looked pretty foolish asking that question a few weeks before this seminar was held. So first up today, I'll provide some context on the Kabul Garrison Command before discussing some various aspects of our experience as an Australian advisor team and a framework nation lead advisor team in the NATO Resolute Support Mission, and discuss what I consider to be some common considerations for BPC doctrine. So the Kabul Garrison General Command was re-established in mid-2015 under presidential decree, and Australia assumed the advisory responsibility for the KGC in early 2016. Despite this version of the Kabul Garrison Command being about 2.5 years old now, it had operated in various guises as the Kabul Garrison General Command in the pre-Soviet socialist Afghan era, the Soviet occupation, and in the early years of the international coalition's insertion in the early 2000s. So the name of the Kabul Garrison Command and its presence on the orbit of the Afghan security forces evoked different emotions and different responses from different stakeholders within the Afghan security, political and general communities. And the fact that it had been established on direction from the President in mid-15, President Ghani, vice the recommendation of his generals and senior ministers, also meant that its presence was, had different levels of support across the ANDSF framework and across the ministries and the general staff. So the Kabul Garrison's Command's mission was to provide a single point of command and control for security in Kabul province, arguably the strategic vital ground of that theatre. It was under a three-star General Officer Commander, and it was to be the ANDSF's first joint, but I would argue actually interagency rather than a traditional joint command, with operational command, and I put command in inverted commas there, of the Afghan National Army, the National Police and the National Directorate of Security Personnel, totalling approximately about 25,000 full-time, maybe 35,000 or thereabouts when they put some of the reserves in the streets. Its area of operations was Kabul province, an area of about 4,500 square kilometres, with a population estimated to be somewhere between 5.5 and 6 million people, and regarded by the World Bank as the 5th fastest growing region in the world. The span of command of KGC involved the Ministry of Forces from the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of Interior, and the headquarters of the National Directorate of Security. And as such, Kabul Garrison Command had no raise, train, sustain responsibilities in its portfolio, and each ministry continued to exercise full command over their respective forces. In addition, the National Security Council and the President on occasion would routinely directly task Kabul Garrison Command. So all in all, it was a complicated chain of command requiring an Afghan commander who was able to cooperate, coordinate and cajole. The Kabul Garrison Command had a very broad range of responsibilities, and on any given day could be involved in planning, coordinating and executing operations, classic counterinsurgency, counter-narcotics, law and order, major event VIP security, land disputes between government and private individuals, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and internally displaced persons management. However, its responsibilities and accountabilities did not align with the allocated authorities and resources that had been given to it. And this was a challenge not unique to the Afghan security forces. I'm sure many that have been who are involved in the early days of the Australian Theatre Command would understand those challenges of responsibilities not aligned to authorities and resources, or anyone who's worked recently in the Strong Strategic Centre, certainly pre-First Principles. So that's a bit of a context and hopefully provided some context on the Garrison Command, but I think demonstrated a key doctrinal consideration as well, which is you need to know and understand the history of the organisation you're advising, its roles, responsibilities, accountabilities, resources and authority. Furthermore, you need to understand or know and understand the political considerations that the host nation government and its ministries have placed in relation to the organisation and its mission that you're working alongside. You need to understand where it sits in the priority of effort for the operational campaign. Is it the main effort, the supporting effort, or just an economy of force operation? Because obviously it will be your main effort as the advisors, but it may not be the main effort or even on the priorities of effort for the host nation. And for many of these types of activities, we'll be doing it as part of coalitions and obviously Afghanistan as part of the NATO Resolute Support Mission. So understanding the strategic considerations of the coalition and the wider international community and where their focus was also places a role of where your organisation may sit in the pecking order. And last but not least, certainly not least, is understanding the strategic considerations of your national government. Why have they made the decision to put you in that advisory role against that organisation? And what do they expect of the outcomes from that? So fully understanding where your organisation sits in that priority of effort and in that context is essential, and I think is relevant to any type of building partner capacity mission that is undertaken anywhere in the region or in the globe. And is a universal consideration. For us in the advisory team of the Kabul Garrison, understanding this context allowed us to appropriately review and plan our approach to building their capacity, but as well as how we needed to work with the flanking and subordinate coalition force advisor teams. So planning for these types of operations can rarely be done in isolation. And we've heard the examples that have been given to us today and very well explained by Professor Blaxland when he talked about the different types of relationships, the ASEAN link and the like for East Timor. But I don't think any are done in isolation, regardless of the nature of the activity. They're either part of a wider coalition or, if purely nationally, they're part of a whole of government national effort. And therefore any planning must be done and coordinated horizontally and vertically. And I think it's essential that you plan with an enduring mindset. Whilst we've talked about the initial thoughts of it's always going to be in and out, the reality is very different. And if each team plans with a short-term mindset, then it is very difficult to achieve enduring effect and enduring change, because each organisation goes in with its own end state in mind as opposed to being part of a longer term end state. As the third rotation of the Kabul Garrison Command Australian Advisor Team, we very much sought to remain aligned with, learn from and build on the efforts of the previous two rotations. And this was our approach in all aspects of our preparation and execution. We developed an operational plan that evolved from the previous rotation's operational order, but incorporated changes from firstly an updated Resolute Support Op Board, our two headquarters, and aligned itself against the international community's agreement for a 4-year commitment to Afghanistan, which took us out to 2020. The O plan was built on 4 lines of effort along a 4-year timeline. The first one, empowering the Kabul Garrison Command. And this was all about focusing on promoting the authority, the legitimacy and the influence of the organisation. And that was within the ANDSF itself, building its credibility within the security framework, the host nation security framework, building its credibility with its government, the Resolute Support Coalition partners, the general public and the wider international community. This line of effort was designed to empower the Kabul Garrison Command to execute its mission and establish its credentials as the authoritative headquarters within Kabul. Our second line of effort, the developing of Kabul Garrison Command, was very much, I suppose, was the main effort of the advisors, but out to 2020. It was not our particular rotation's main effort. It's designed to develop those systems, plans, processes and policies, and is very much it sits within the advise part of a TAA mission. It is the deep battle. I think it was General Dunford when he was in Afghanistan who coined these two terms in relation to TAA, obviously taking it from the conventional warfighting space, but he saw it as the deep battle, in this case that established Kabul Garrison Command as a self-reliant and increasingly self-sustainable organisation. Our third line of effort is securing Kabul, or KGC securing Kabul. So optimising the KGC's conduct of operations and provision of security in Kabul. It's the close battle, aimed at achieving security by, with and through the Kabul Garrison Command with coalition force assistance. So it's the assist in the TAA mission. And this was very much our designated decisive line of operation or line of effort for our deployment because of the nature of where we sat within the campaign and the current security environment. And finally, the fourth line of effort was posturing the Kabul Garrison Command advisor team. That is, to protect, promote, sustain and regulate the advisor team in the context of the NATO mission. Adhere to national and coalition force recommended force protection measures, operate at a sustainable tempo and manage risk as low as reasonably practicable. So make sure that Australia and the government was comfortable in continuing to commit itself in this type of activity going forward. As a team, we would manage or conduct a monthly review and assessment of these lines of effort and their subordinate milestones and outcomes. It's essential, and we all know it's essential to evaluate progress, identify areas for future advisor effort and make adjustments as the situation changed, as it rapidly did, certainly in the last part of our tour. These assessments were based against both the Resolute Support Missions Advisor Framework of essential functions, so we worked within a guiding criteria of how advisory effort was to be assessed, but it also provided our forum to develop our reporting up and out in relation to the advisor mission. The approach to planning and execution is obviously a common feature of all BPC activities, and while it provides a map of how we undertake our mission, I would argue it's meaningless without having the right people to implement it. And thankfully, the points that I'm going to raise here, I'm sorry, it replicates very much what many have spoken about earlier today, about getting the right people. So getting the right people is critical, and not necessarily the individual with the strongest skills or knowledge. While it's no doubt the appropriate experience in the type of environment being employed is important, be that individual soldier training or advising at a joint operational headquarters level, it's important having the right attitude and personality. And getting it wrong doesn't just impact on building capacity of your host nation partners, but also potentially affects your personal safety and security. And those points have been well made by earlier speakers today. And I can only strongly endorse what they have all said. There is a large amount of professional literature discussing the importance of this aspect of the BPC or TAA mission. And yet it is my observation, like has been brought out in earlier discussion, we are starting to apply a very broad brush approach of getting bums on seats when it comes to filling some of these teams, especially when they're not generated from organic units such as the KGC advisor team. Perhaps this is a result of organisational operational fatigue. We have been now manning operations of various kinds consistently for 16 or 17 years. But we must be able to establish and maintain relationships based on the respect and able to get on with people from different cultures. This is not only required for our advisors, but also how we interface and work with our interpreters and our linguist support. And something I'll talk about in a second. The other aspect of getting the right selection is the diversity of experience that you bring to your team. I was very fortunate, our team, a small team of 11 personnel, but bringing in reserve officers with specialist skill sets. We're working with police as well as army and intelligence forces, so we brought in reservists with policing backgrounds. Building that diversity of experience in your advisor team greatly generates, and we all know this from building diverse teams, builds different ideas, different approaches, and was something that we very much benefited from. And I know previous iterations of the Kabul Garrison Advisor team also found that experience. And I know Sean Richards is in the room today, and he can talk to that as well as his experience in the first rotation of this operation. But interpreters. Interpreters are a critical requirement in any BPC mission, or almost any BPC, because I'm sure someone will highlight an example where they weren't required. But like all personnel, they need to be led, managed and supported. There will be a training and ongoing learning and development bill that comes with having interpreters, be they ADF linguists or contracted solution. And it's an area that I think is both essential but also an often overlooked aspect of the BPC mission set. Your interpreters will either be locally employed or contracted foreign nationals, be they US or Australian citizens who are former foreign nationals. I won't speak to the ADF linguist capability in this aspect, but you need to be able to establish effective relationships with the interpreters, and they too need to be able to establish effective relationships with your host nation counterparts. And they need to be able to communicate effectively and appropriately, and most importantly, in accordance with your direction. Their security must be considered, both their security from each other, noting that potentially US citizens and locally employed, they have potential opportunities to leverage off each other. From host nation forces, we had multiple experiences of our locally employed interpreters being harassed, shaken down and the like from the host nation forces that we were advising, mostly not the individuals, but the guard forces and the like that they had to get through to come onto base. And of course, they need to be protected from the adversary. For Kabul, and certainly for all of Kabul, the local staff lived off base, so you don't have control. They are completely, after work, they are completely in their own personal time and their access is uncontrolled. So their security, we still have a responsibility for it. We need to consider how we manage that. I think we found also that you need to be conscious of how locally employed interpreters interact with members of their security forces. They can be deferential, topic avoidance, an unwillingness to engage in those sometimes difficult discussions because the member of the senior member of the internal security force is not a man to be, or in most cases in Afghanistan, a man to be trifled with. And so we found that we needed to change out personalities actively. We brought in US citizens to work with the more senior internal security officers who straight away changed the dynamic of the relationship because they were no longer in a power relationship or the same sort of power relationship. We also had to look at it through the lens of the internal security officers. They didn't wish to be discussing what they saw as sensitive matters with us, with a locally employed citizen in the room. So these are all things that I think we need to consider, and in managing and working with interpreters and linguist support is a key universal consideration of any type of BPC mission. Excuse me. Another point to note in regards to interpreters, especially for locally employed, is what is the Australian government's policy on immigration? Because that can be quite an incentive for many to seek employment if they understand that there's an opportunity for potential immigration downstream. So you need to consider those factors as well when you undertake these missions. The conduct of BPC, though, incorporates more than just the advisors and the interpreters. In today's operations, we now have the force protection element, which is obviously distinct from probably the advisor team of Vietnam experience and some more recent contemporary. So there's the third element to the triangle. And depending on the model in which this deployment is occurring, it may be that you are falling in on a pre-existing force protection element, or they are falling in on you, depending on how it works. So building up a relationship with them and inculcating a whole team culture, even though you might have multiple chains of command, building that whole team culture of achieving an advisor effect and the building partner capacity effect with the various elements is essential. The force protection need to understand what you do, how you need to go about doing it, and you need to obviously work with them to enable them to carry out their mission just as importantly. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of education and learning that's required and training, both pre and potentially in theatre as well, depending on the nature of the force rotation. Sorry. The next universal consideration that I sort of saw was understanding how people learn and how to train, coach or mentor, and having a grounding in how people learn and understand the differences between those. You know, what is training versus what is coaching, what is mentoring. They're all very different, and there's a good body of literature out there in the wider professional circles to explain that, but we need to understand the difference. And I think doctrine is a good place to highlight those differences, because each type of mission and BPC mission could have a different emphasis. Some can be very training heavy focused, others like the Kabul Garrison Command, much more in the, I would argue, coaching, a little bit of mentoring, but more in the coaching, because I haven't been a 3-star operational joint commander before. So as a mentor, I can't use my previous experience to explain and provide advice, but what I can do is, like a military assistant, ask a senior officer the right question they already know the answer to, but ask it at the right time and in the right way that leads them to consider that point at that particular point in time. So I certainly approached my role as more a coach, to elicit answers that our senior officers already knew, or the senior officers already knew in their own mind. They just needed the time and space and the wherewithal or the prompt to bring it forward in their mindset. So getting that balance right between training, which is using host nation doctrine and policy and processes, which is, I think, as someone referred to it today, as the how to fish. The assisting, in some cases producing operational product to use as demonstrations and examples. So it's, you're bringing the fish to the table, but in the instance of a learning method. And then advising, which is trying to talk through the different fishing techniques and when to apply them in certain different environments. So the cultural ethics and values, and I know it's been raised as well this morning already, which is great, but you know, all I'd say is understanding the culture and discussing, you know, your organisation's ethics and values and understanding their organisation's ethics and values. You need to discuss it early and often. For the Kabul Garrison Command, we conducted sessions during our pre-deployment training that discussed our ethics and values of our organisation, but also trying to understand the ethics and values of the Afghan security forces and the Kabul Garrison Command. We use scenarios based on fact, but with alternative futures. So talking through if certain types of officers came into senior positions that had records and histories of mixed human rights records, how would we go about working alongside them? And you know, General Razik in Kandahar is a great example of an officer that is achieving, you know, varying levels of effect, but with a mixed human rights background and record. And how would he, if he moved into a position or we were advising someone like him, how would we approach that? And those are discussions that you need to have early and I would say often. And it's certainly something that we did throughout the tour, was continue to check and monitor ourselves and understand where our differences lay. And we used subject matter experts, you know, via the virtues of, you know, modern technology to dial in and have facilitate some of those discussions. We were able to use CDLE, King's College School of Ethics and others dial in and sort of facilitate some of those discussions. And one of the things that really came out as a great lesson for us was understanding the difference between trust and honesty. So having trust in our counterparts and establishing trust with each other, but understanding that their concept of honesty was quite different to ours. And often that was to save face, bald-faced lies when they didn't wish to be, found to be unaware of a certain issue or a certain problem. They just, lie the problem away. But understanding that there is a difference, there can be a difference between having trust and them trusting us and us trusting them as partners, but also their concept of honesty can be quite different. And you need to discuss that, I would argue, you need to discuss that and have your team and your advisors understand those differences and be able to accept them, work within them, but also understand when there's red lines potentially being crossed. So, we talked about encountering corruption, understanding what is corruption, how to report it, and who do you report it to and how it may impact on your mission. We certainly encountered it at various levels within working alongside our Afghan counterparts. Human rights issues we've talked about as well today. Our first week in the tour was the week in which the 31 May German embassy car bomb erupted, and then the protests after that, and then the subsequent 6 civilian deaths that occurred at the hands of or allegedly occurred at the hands of ANDSF forces who allegedly shot at unarmed protesters. This set the tone for our first few weeks in theatre. It brought about the suspension of the first of the commanders that I worked alongside, a 3-star general officer, and as I said, set the tone. It involved us engaging with the United Nations Human Rights section that was in Kabul. We organised interviews for them, along with the suspended commander and ourselves. So it is something that you will come across, and it needs to be considered as, I think, a universal consideration in BPC. And the last aspect in that ethics, values and understanding culture is, having discussions about removing and replacing host nation counterparts. So when you're working alongside individuals who are not meeting the grade, they know, and how do you have those discussions and develop strategies to have them with, for me, with the 3-star general officer, about replacing his 1-star chief of operations. They're tough discussions. They're tough discussions that would be had in this room and in our own military. Having it when you're a foreigner, having it with a foreign national senior officer and telling him, how do you come up with a strategy to tell him that his chief of operations needs to be sacked, and doing it in a way that saves face for him, the chief of operations and the like. And they're things that you need to plan, war game out before you go in the room and prepare. So some points just coming towards the end now of executing. I think the key message that I would say is execute your mission in a consistent and graduated approach. If every rotation of an organisation goes in with its own microcosm of start and finish, it has the potential to make it very difficult for your host nation counterparts to understand what they and we are trying to achieve together. I think look towards standing on the shoulders of each successor, and each rotation stands on the shoulders of the last, is a far more graduated and consistent approach. It brings consistency to the relationship with the Afghans, who may deal with 3 of us in their one tenure, whereas we're obviously only there for a short time. And it also ensures that you remain within the overarching coalition or national force approach. And consider how you can adopt an approach in which you are seeking to learn rather than teaching. So rather than going in thinking that it's all going to be about information delivery, it's more about actually learning more from them and then adjusting the way in which they approach something based on what you've been able to learn from them in the first instance. You need to think about clearly how you're going to work with the other advisor teams. Whilst you'll be, one of many, there will be superior, flanking and subordinate advisor teams, and it's sort of like the shadow tracking. We called it the shadow tracking of making sure whatever we did, or the Afghans was doing, we'd keep the flanking, subordinate and superior advisor teams aware, and likewise they would us, so we could work in a consistent approach as opposed to one organisation heading off in one direction and us in another. So you need to align that effort and focus. And that routine internal debriefing, the ability to download and vent after difficult and challenging days where you see very little progress being made, and that's the reality. It's all micro steps, and I know I'm preaching to converted here because everyone's probably been and done it, but it's having that mindset of micro steps, but over a long period of time, macro change occurs. But you need the ability within your teams to have a safe environment to download and vent and work through the challenges that you may have encountered in that day, but not being judged or critiqued on it. And I think that's you need to have the business rules about what stays in the room as well when you are venting and when you are critiquing your Afghan or your host nation counterparts. But they're all business rules that need to be considered and developed. Finally, some guiding principles that we took away. Our approach was built on 3 sort of key points: being respectful always to each other, to our ANDSF counterparts and our coalition partners, and understanding that relationships matter. Relationships, almost every outcome in these missions will require a positive interaction with other people. So building and maintaining relationships is essential for your success and the success of your successors. And seeing the bigger picture, understanding the role you and your host nation organisation has within the broader campaign, constantly seeking to learn and understand throughout the deployment and adjusting as necessary. There's no substitute for reading and learning from others, and I'd highly encourage it. There are many articles and publications written by our contemporaries on their advising experiences. One that I found worthwhile was Edward Donnelly's approach to advising in the Small Wars Journal. Although his focus was at the strategic and institutional level, some of the points that he raised had absolutely universal merit. You know, be humble. We didn't get it right the first time, and learning from our own mistakes and using those experiences for our host nation partners to avoid is a powerful way of achieving outcomes rather than trying to imply that ours is best practice. Being open-minded, being sensitive, being realistic about what you achieve, you know, see the long game and what they have the capacity to implement and adopt. Persistence and consistency, flexibility, understanding, remembering that your counterpart has a day job and it's often in contact with an aggressive adversary, and being durable, patient and resilient. And these are all points that many of other speakers have raised far more eloquently than I can. But hopefully that's given you a snapshot of some of the experiences of working at the operational level and working across interagency, and some of the points that I think are universally applicable to all types of BPC missions. And that's it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time.